On the colony, they called it the weather house, the low, round building at the edge of the town where the weather was made. For the colony had no weather of its own. Not really. It lived under a great soft sky held up by machines on a world that would have been bare rock and hard radiation without them. And so the rain that fell on its gardens, and the mild gray mornings, and the warm gold afternoons, and the gentle mist that came down some evenings off the low hills were none of them accidents. They were made. And the man who made them was Ansel, who had kept the weather house for the better part of 40 years, and who thought of the sky over the town as a garden he tended, coaxing it, day by day, into gentleness. The town did not think much about him. That was rather the point. Good weather, like good health, is a thing people only notice in its absence, and Ansel had spent 40 years making sure the town never had cause to notice it at all. The weather the colony had was gentle, and it was kind, and it was always, in its way, the same. Warm days and mild nights, and rain enough for the crops, and never storm. For the founders had built the weather house to keep the people safe and comfortable, and safety and comfort do not, on the whole, include extremes. In all his 40 years, Ansel had never made it truly cold. He had never made it snow. The machines could not easily do it, for one thing, having been built for a warm and steady world. And for another, no one had ever asked. The children of the colony had grown up generation upon generation now, knowing snow only as a word in the old stories from Earth, a white thing that fell from the sky and covered the world and was cold and beautiful and gone by spring. None of them had ever seen it. Most of them never thought to wish they had. It was simply not a thing that happened here. Ansel sometimes wondered, in his long evenings at the instruments, whether that was a loss. The colony was safe and warm and comfortable, and its people wanted for nothing the sky could give them. But a world without weather, he had come to think, is a world without surprises, and a life without surprises, however comfortable, is a smaller life than it might be. On Earth, the old stories said, you never quite knew what the sky would do. It might be kind, or it might be cruel, but it was alive, and it kept you awake to it, made you look up, made you glad on a fine morning in a way that a person is never quite glad of a thing they can simply count on. He had made the colony a sky it could count on. It had been the right thing to do, and he did not regret it. But he understood, better than anyone alive, exactly what it had cost. But there was one soul in the colony who remembered. Old Elka was the last of them, the last person alive on the whole world who had been born on Earth, who had crossed as a small child on one of the first ships, and who could say, and say truly, I have stood in real snow. She was very old now, and very frail, and the doctors had told her family, gently, that she would not see another turning of the year. And Ansel, who had known her all his life, and who visited her sometimes in the long evenings, sat with her one night as she looked out her window at his mild and gentle sky, and heard her say, not as a complaint, only as an old woman remembering aloud, that the one thing she still wished for, the one thing before the end, was to see the snow again. The real snow of her childhood, the hush of it, the way it came down out of a gray sky, slow and silent, and made the whole loud world soft and new and quiet. She told him about it. That evening, the way the very old will sometimes give you a whole vanished world in a few quiet sentences. How she had woken as a girl to find the light in her room gone strange and bright, and run to the window, and seen the ordinary street she knew made unrecognizable and beautiful, every hard edge softened, every dull thing crowned with white. How her whole noisy family had gone out into it together and been, for once, silenced by it, standing in the falling hush. How her mother, long dead now, longer than Ansel had been alive, had held her hand in the snow and told her to remember this, that would not last, that nothing so beautiful ever did, and that this was exactly why she must hold on to it. And she had held it. She had carried that one morning of snow across the whole dark gulf between the worlds, and kept it safe inside her for 80 years, and it was, she said, still as bright in her as the day it fell. She knew it was a foolish wish, she said, and patted his hand, and said no more about it. But Ansel went home that night to his weather house, and did not sleep, and began, quietly, to think. It was not a simple thing he set himself to do. The weather house had never made snow and did not want to. The machines fought him at every turn, for they had been built to keep the world warm and safe, and he was asking them now to make it cold. He worked at it for weeks, in the evenings, in secret, telling no one, for he did not want to raise the town's hopes, nor Elka's, in case he failed. He coaxed the temperature down a degree at a time across the high air, so slowly that no one below would feel the change. He gathered the moisture and cooled it, and taught the reluctant machines, patiently, night after night, the old forgotten trick of turning rain to snow. He was an old man himself, and tired, and it would have been far easier to leave it, to tell himself it could not be done, that a wish was only a wish. But he thought of Elka at her window, and of the doctor's gentle words, and of the fact that he had spent his whole life making the sky do gentle things, and that here at last was the gentlest and best thing his sky had ever been asked to do. And so he kept on. There were nights he very nearly gave it up. Nights when the machines threw back his careful adjustments and warmed the air stubbornly to their old, comfortable default. And Ansel sat among his blinking instruments, an exhausted old man far past the age when he ought to have been doing such things, and thought that Elka would understand if he failed, that a wish spoken aloud is not a promise, that no one would ever know he had even tried. But then he would think of the hush she had described, and the light, and the mother's hand, and the 80 years of carrying it, and he would find that he could not stop. It was not, in the end, only a wish that he was trying to grant. It was a whole life he was trying to honor, the last living thread back to a world they had all come from and mostly forgotten, and he could not let it go dark without giving it one last time the one thing it had loved the most. And then, one gray, still morning near the middle of the colony's mild winter, the town woke to a miracle. It was falling from the sky, small and white and silent, drifting down out of the soft gray clouds and settling, impossibly, on the roofs and the gardens and the quiet streets, whitening the whole world as the town came out of its houses to stare. Snow. The children were the first out, of course, shrieking with a joy they had no word for they had never seen the thing that was happening and did not know to be anything but wild with delight. They caught the flakes on their tongues. They pressed their hands into the white on the garden walls and lifted them and stared at the shapes. The grown-ups came out slower and stood in their doorways and looked up into the falling white with faces gone soft and young, the old stories from Earth coming true above their heads. No one knew how it had happened. No one thought, particularly, of the low, round building at the edge of town, or of the tired old man who had not slept in weeks. They only stood in the falling snow, the whole colony together, and were, all of them at once, filled with a wonder they would remember for the rest of their lives. But there was one window in one small house where the wonder was of a different and a deeper kind. Old Elka woke to a light in her room that she had not seen in 80 years. The particular pale, bright hush of light that only snow makes, the light of her childhood, of a world she had left so long ago that it had become a story even to herself. And she turned her old head on the pillow and looked to her window and saw it fall. And Ansel, who had walked through the snow to her house that morning, and who stood now quietly in her doorway, watched the old woman's face as she looked out at the snow of her girlhood, falling at last, impossibly, from a sky that had never made it before and might never make it again. He watched her weep and smile and reach out one thin old hand toward the glass, toward the white and silent falling of the thing she had wished for and never thought to see again. She did not ask how. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps, looking at the tired old man in her doorway, she understood exactly how and why and by whose long and secret labor. But she did not say. She only looked at him once with her whole heart in her eyes, and then turned back to her window and watched her snow come down, and was, in that moment, entirely and perfectly happy. They did not speak of it, then or ever. There did not seem to be any need. Ansel drew her chair a little closer to the window, so that she might see it the better, and he fetched her shawl from the end of the bed and settled it about her thin shoulders. And then he stood beside her, the two old friends, the last of the earthborn and the man who had made her a sky, and together they watched the snow come down over the colony. Outside, faint and far, they could hear the children shrieking with their impossible joy. And Elka listened to that and watched the white come down and said, at the last, only one thing. "Thank you," she said, so quietly that he barely heard it. Not for the snow, for remembering that I would want it. The snow fell all that day, and the colony played in it and marveled at it, and would speak of it for years. The winter the sky did the impossible thing. The winter it snowed. And then, as gently as it had come, Ansel let it go. He warmed the high air a degree at a time, as slowly as he had cooled it. And by the next morning the snow was melting from the roofs, and the last white patches were shrinking in the gardens, and the colony's mild and gentle weather returned, as though it had never been away. Old Elka slipped from the world a few weeks later, quietly, in her sleep, with the last of her long life behind her and the snow of her childhood freshly in it. The wish of her heart granted at the very end by a friend who had never told her it was him. And Ansel went back to his weather house and his gentle skies and told no one what he had done and needed no one to know. For he had learned, in 40 years of tending the sky, that the finest weather is the kind that is made for someone, on purpose, out of love, and given quietly, and let go. And that a single morning of impossible snow, given to one old woman at the end of a long life, was worth more than all the mild gold afternoons he had ever made. Wherever you happen to be tonight, and whatever quiet task is keeping your hands busy, thank you for spending this little while here with us. Rest easy, and whenever you are ready, there will always be another story waiting.